Welcome to meeting number 5 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence. Pursuant to the motion adopted on September 16, 2025, the committee is meeting to commence a study on the integration of the Canadian Coast Guard into the Department of National Defence. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Pursuant to the standing orders, members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we continue, I would ask all in-person participants to consult the audio guidelines to help prevent feedback incidences and to protect the health and safety of participants, including interpreters. I would like to make a few comments for the benefits of the witnesses and members. 1, please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. And for those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either Floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. And 3, a reminder that all comments should be addressed to the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. And for members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking orders as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Now, before I talk to the witnesses, I know we're in public format. I also want to congratulate all members around the committee for an outstanding job last Wednesday during military exercise. For those of you who are watching, you may not know that the vice chair of the committee had to wear fatigues like the rest of us, and he didn't fall down. So congratulations, Vice Chair, for standing up the entire time of the committee meetings. In fact, it was a very great opportunity for some camaraderie and understanding of what our troops are doing day in, day out, and it was a very worthwhile event. We did over 200 kilometers via off-road vehicles, helicopters, and of course a lot of hiking and walking, and a lot of interaction with our troops who told us firsthand some of the challenges they face and the things we need to overcome. So thank you to the folks at Petawawa for hosting us. Now I would like to welcome the witnesses. Today we have Mr. Chris Henderson. We have Professor James Boutilier. We have the Associate Professor and Director of Canadian Maritime Security Network, Mr. Adam Lejeune, and the National President of the Union of Canadian Transportation Employees, Ms. Teresa Ushchak. I will now like to invite Mr. Henderson to make his opening statement, and I'm going to have opening statements by all 4 of you. But let's start with Mr. Henderson. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning. And thank you to the members of the committee for the opportunity to speak with you this morning on the integration of the Canadian Coast Guard into the Department of National Defence. My name is Chris Henderson. It was my privilege to serve Canada for 37 years, first as a member of the Royal Canadian Navy, where I served at sea and ashore, and subsequently in a range of executive positions in the Federal Public Service, mostly concerned with defense and security. I retired in April 2024 after serving 4 years as the Deputy Commissioner for Operations at the Canadian Coast Guard. It was in that capacity that I worked to raise the profile of the Coast Guard within the national security apparatus of Canada, as well as try to promote a stronger focus within the Coast Guard on the contribution it could make to Canada's national security. Both efforts took more time and energy than one might expect. Fortunately, we are meeting today because there has been a sea change in the evolution of the Coast Guard, and I would like to share my thoughts on how to realize the potential of the Coast Guard as an instrument of national power that can make much deeper contributions to the safety, security, and sovereignty of the nation in years to come. 2 major developments occurred early this year that should lead the Coast Guard in this positive direction. The first was the introduction of Bill C-2, which, for the first time, has codified a formal role for the Coast Guard in national security, specifically that it will henceforth be charged with collecting, analyzing, and sharing intelligence about Canada's maritime domain. The second was the machinery of government change that recently saw the move of the Coast Guard from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to the Department of National Defence. These are important changes, to be sure, but to be frank, these are but the first baby steps to get the Coast Guard where it should have been years ago, and where I would submit Canadians could be forgiven for expecting it already was. And by this, I mean conceptually, as opposed to being specifically part of national defense. While this is a modest start, there remain gaps in the Coast Guard's toolkit that militate against the realization of its potential. First, my strong recommendation is to provide new legislation, the Canadian Coast Guard Act, that would enshrine its national security role, provide a framework for the future delegation of additional authorities, and make the commissioner a deputy head within the federal public service, backed by its own departmental staff, so that he or she may assume their appropriate, equal position among the leaders of Canada's defense, security, and intelligence agencies. Secondly, I believe the Coast Guard should be given a law enforcement mandate to protect Canada's interests anytime and anywhere in our huge expanse of maritime territory. Such a mandate would augment, not diminish, the roles of the RCMP, Canada Border Services Agency, or the Conservation and Protection Branch of Fisheries and Oceans. Such a change would, however, require significant culture change and a long runway to achieve success. Next, there remain a variety of maritime safety and security tools vested in other departments that should be consolidated within a legislated Coast Guard. These include, but are not limited to, the National Aerial Surveillance Program and the Office of Boating Safety, both currently within Transport Canada, the Canadian Hydrographic Service, which is part of Fisheries and Oceans, and the Canadian Ice Service of Environment and Climate Change. Additionally, it will be imperative for Canada's leaders to recognize and expand upon the Coast Guard's areas of quiet, perennial excellence, which provide our nation with a significant comparative advantage in a region of growing importance and strategic focus. For example, the Coast Guard has deep operational links grounded in 60 plus years of Arctic experience with the Coast Guards and navies of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. The British, Chilean, German, Japanese, and Korean Coast Guards are also strengthening their connections with the Canadian Coast Guard because of its matchless expertise in the Arctic. All of this is to say nothing of the profound relationship between the Canadian and the United States Coast Guards and the opportunity for Canada to take a leading role in defending the northwest flank of NATO, or the Canadian Coast Guard's leadership in multilateral Coast Guard fora around the world. Of course, coasties are far too modest to toot their own horns, but I can assure you that every like-minded nation with interests in the Atlantic, Pacific, or Arctic oceans respects the Coast Guard's operational excellence and seeks its advice and guidance. Indeed, our adversaries also respect the Canadian Coast Guard's track record in the Arctic, and it is possible, if not immediately likely, that in a post-bellum world, the Canadian Coast Guard could provide some space for confidence-building measures between erstwhile competitors. In the meantime, and much more urgently, we owe it to Canadians to maximize the investments being made in the renewal of the Coast Guard's fleet by harnessing it fully to the effort to monitor, understand, and protect Canada's maritime domain on all 4 of Canada's coasts. Every ship must be a sensor. Every one of those sensors must be connected to a robust, secure network over which data, intelligence, and action flow seamlessly. And every member of every crew must see themselves as a vital part of that web of knowledge, security, and sovereignty. And all of this is something that we need to do and do well for ourselves as a mature nation with an obligation to safeguard our national interests, not because of pressure from the United States or through the erroneous belief that moving the Coast Guard to defense will tip the balance in our NATO contributions. I am deeply gratified that this House committee is taking the time to study the implications of the evolution of the Coast Guard as it assumes greater responsibility within the national security apparatus of the nation. The interest and leadership of each member of this committee is truly important and necessary to ensure this good work continues. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I'll now pass it over to Mr. James Boutier. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome you from the pre-dawn darkness of Victoria on the West Coast. I'd like to make 4 or 5 observations by way of scene setting. I applaud the government's decision to incorporate the Coast Guard within D&D. My colleague, Mr. Henderson, has outlined elegantly and articulately the value of that integration. It is, in my estimation, very long overdue indeed. It's a blindingly obvious symbiotic relationship between two maritime organizations desperately in need of greater financial support and attention. It's a case, I think, where the sum is much more than the whole of the parts. We have a Coast Guard fleet larger numerically than the major elements of the Royal Canadian Navy, and one which has an acute and intimate understanding of our Great Northern Flank. It was back in 1957 that HMCS Labrador, the Arctic patrol ship of the Royal Canadian Navy, last transited the Arctic. More recently, of course, as you are well aware, the Arctic and offshore patrol ships have, in fact, operated in the area, but they are in many ways woefully inadequate in terms of the equipment which they carry on board. I think there has been, over the years, an abject failure on the part of successive governments to honor the principal responsibility that they have. That is to say, to provide defense and security for the nation. What makes their conduct even more criminal, and I use that word with some care, is that they were fully aware of the inadequacy of the preparations involved with respect to the Canadian Armed Forces and in this setting with respect to the Canadian Coast Guard. There was an element of complacency and naivety which we are now obliged to address. For years, we were, to put it frankly, a nation of sleepwalkers in terms of the larger security dimension. We live, ladies and gentlemen, in what is self-evidently a dangerous and difficult and different world. And our opponents are brutal, they are intent, and they will give us no quarter in the final analysis. We have become accustomed, rightly, to operating according to rules of law and to principles of warfare, and these are, for the most part, irrelevant to our principal competitors. They march to a different drum, and we need to be fully aware of that fact. We are, in a word, at war. I don't say that unnecessarily, I don't say that provocatively, but when you look at the steady deterioration of the international geostrategic environment, what you see in sabotage, in interference operations, in gray zone activities, threatens the very integrity of Canada, and we would be, I think, sir, naive indeed if we failed to appreciate that and prepare accordingly. What I would leave you with is one word: urgency. This, in my estimation, reviewing the activities in the defense and security realm over the past 25 years has been woefully absent. Time is not on our side. And we face a resolute and, in many ways, enormous competitor. We have, for example, only to look at the Chinese Coast Guard, 225 ships, including two 10,000-ton vessels, larger than anything in the Royal Canadian Navy. This is a force which is not benign like our Coast Guard, but used in a paramilitary role to advance China's interests. We have Russia with 41 icebreakers, a situation which will be impossible to replicate without decades of endeavor on our part. So this is a deeply serious state of affairs. We can no longer be laggards. We must act with immediate resolve. And the union of the Coast Guard and the Navy in an operational context is an enormously important and positive step in terms of enhancing the ability of both services to increase our sensory capacity and to expand our knowledge, particularly in the high north. Thank you very much, sir.
Professor, thank you very much for your comments. I'll pass it over to Mr. Lejeune. You have 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to provide comments today representing both the Naval Association of Canada and the Canadian Maritime Security Network. To begin with, I applaud the government's decision to move Coast Guard to DND. It's a move that is long overdue. I intend to focus today on areas where greater integration, training, operations, and capability development can address current challenges and enhance Canada's maritime effectiveness. First, an opportunity. Today, many of the RCN's junior officers are not receiving meaningful exposure to life at sea during the first 12 to 18 months of their commission. There is simply a lack of ship space. This lack of early sea time represents a missed opportunity, both for professional development, retention, and personnel advancement, and for facilitating operational readiness. The Coast Guard operates year-round, including in demanding Arctic environments, and embedding junior RCN officers aboard Coast Guard vessels during their initial training period would allow these officers to gain valuable real-world experience. At the same time, the Coast Guard would benefit from their presence and skills, since the Coast Guard is itself short of personnel. Such an arrangement would be mutually advantageous and would help to build a generation of naval officers with a broader understanding of Canada's maritime operational landscape. To formalize this collaboration, I propose the creation of a combined officer and sailor training program between the RCN and the Canadian Coast Guard. This could include the establishment of a single schoolhouse, core elements of officer training, ensuring that both organizations receive consistent foundational instruction. The standardization of qualifications is important, especially in areas like maritime engineering, which would make personnel more interchangeable and enable smoother collaboration during joint operations. Coordinating training deployments would give junior officers and sailors exposure to a wide variety of vessels, operating environments, and mission types. As a secondary benefit, it would also establish the formative years of in the formative years of service, a better understanding of each other's challenges and work environments, thereby, hopefully, fostering lasting professional personal relationships. Such integration would not only improve individual competency, but would strengthen institutional ties between the Navy and the Coast Guard. Second, the Canadian Coast Guard's fleet could also play a larger role in supporting national defense operations, particularly in the Arctic. For example, Coast Guard vessels could conduct expanded hydrographic and survey missions in the northern waters, generating data that will directly support RCN operational planning and navigation. The growth of the Coast Guard fleet will hopefully provide that spare capacity. Outfitting selected Coast Guard vessels with appropriate communication systems and possibly electronic support mechanisms would enable them to operate effectively in combined task groups when forming such task groups makes sense. This would require ensuring that Coast Guard personnel receive the necessary training and familiarity with some of this new electronic equipment and be granted security clearances to handle classified information and to safeguard such systems in Coast Guard vessels. Deploying UAVs from Coast Guard vessels for coastal surveillance and intelligence gathering would also significantly augment Canada's maritime domain awareness. A joint UAV procurement and training program with the Navy, which is also moving in this direction, would have obvious economies of scale. These measures would enhance both surveillance and response capability without requiring the immediate acquisition of new platforms. We should also consider reallocating certain marine coastal defense vessel roles to the Coast Guard where appropriate. By leveraging the Coast Guard's existing infrastructure and expertise in areas like coastal patrol and surveillance, the RCN could focus its limited resources on higher-end warfighting capabilities. In tandem, Canada could explore arming select Coast Guard vessels and establishing procedures for the carriage of ammunition, allowing them to undertake limited defensive or enforcement tasks where appropriate and authorized. Such changes would be significant and must be accompanied by appropriate training, policy development, and legal frameworks. They're worth examining as part of a grand strategy. There are also important communications issues at play here. The Coast Guard workforce is very anxious at present about how this move changes their employment terms, career progression, and tasks. This change arrived suddenly, and I think better communications are needed about what this means at the HR and operational level. A second critical issue is how the Coast Guard's current command and control model would fit within the hierarchical, centralized military structure. The Coast Guard currently operates with strong, independent regional organizations, and for good reason. Over many decades, Coast Guard has refined a structure that reflects the vast diversity of Canada's marine environment and the distinct operational requirements of each region. This decentralized model is not a historical accident. It's deliberate and provides structure built into to meet Canada's extraordinary marine challenges. So imposing a top-down deferential hierarchy characteristic of military and naval command would risk undermining the effectiveness of those regional organizations that have been built over decades. So I recommend a strong voice from Coast Guard in how this move is affected and how these new chains of command are built. In summary, greater integration between the RCN and the Coast Guard offers real benefits, capability development, and effectiveness by combining training programs, aligning qualifications, and enhancing Coast Guard platforms with modern surveillance and communication systems. Canada can achieve more resilient and flexible maritime operations. I urge the committee to pay close attention to workforce engagement, communication strategy, and organizational design as part of any future integration discussions. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to take your questions.
Thank you. Lastly, Ms. Ocek, you have up to 5 minutes as well, and then we'll get into a round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and to weigh in on this important issue. I'm here on behalf of the Union of Canadian Transportation Employees, which represents more than 3,500 Canadian Coast Guard workers. These are the men and women who crew our ships, launch in all weathers to save lives, monitor marine traffic on all three coasts, protecting our environment, staff our rescue coordination centers, and keep our historic lighthouses lit. They are proud of their role, proud of their civilian service, and proud of the unique contribution of the Canadian Coast Guard makes to Canada's security and safety. We do not oppose the moving of responsibilities of the Coast Guard to national defense. We do, however, want to raise key issues and concerns that matters most to our members. I would like to begin with the Coast Guard's legacy and identity. The Coast Guard has never been on the sidelines of Canada's defense. During the Second World War, lighthouse keepers along the Atlantic and Pacific served as Canada's first line of defense, literally keeping the lights on as our eyes on the coast. This history continues today. The Coast Guard has quietly but steadfastly supported fisheries and oceans, Transport Canada, national defense when it comes to protecting Canada's waterways. It has done so with skill, professionalism, and dedication, but often with inadequate tools and declining infrastructure. Many of our historic lighthouses, for example, have fallen into disarray through neglect and lack of proper funding. If this transfer proceeds, which we know it has, we hope it will not mean further erosion, but rather renewed investment in these critical assets that are part of Canada's maritime backbone. The first and perhaps greatest concern we must raise is chronic underfunding. For decades, the Coast Guard has been stretched far too thin. Too few vessels, too little modern equipment, too few trained hands to crew them. Recruitment and retention are serious problems, especially for our seafarers and search and rescue technicians. Many of our members believe that under Fisheries and Oceans, funds intended for the Coast Guard operations were too often absorbed in the department's own internal operations. Every dollar allocated must reach...
Ms. Uchak,
yes.
Can you raise your headset just a little bit? You're just a bit higher up.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Let's
Is
see if
that
that
better?
works. The better, yeah.
Is that better? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's better. Very good. Continue.
Okay, great. Thank you. Many of our members believe that under Fisheries and Oceans funds intended for the Coast Guard were too often absorbed into the department's own internal operations. We must ensure every dollar allocated to the Coast Guard reaches the Coast Guard and I'm sorry. The monies need to recover new duties, but also need to repair the long-standing gaps in people and equipment. The second concern is one of identity. Our members choose the Coast Guard because it's a civilian agency. They are not soldiers. They did not list in the Canadian Armed Forces. They provide a distinct essential service as civilians, and that must be preserved. The Coast Guard is at its best when it's focused on saving lives, ensuring safe navigation, and protecting our coasts. Its credibility depends on its neutrality, its accessibility, and its civilian mandate. We urge this committee to affirm clearly that the Coast Guard remain a civil aviation under the umbrella of national defense. The third is marine security itself. The Marine Security Operations Center, MSOC, bring together multiple departments, including DND, RCMP, CBSA, Transport Canada, and the Coast Guard to coordinate intelligence and response on our waterways. Originally, Coast Guard operated 7 MSOC bases, providing 24/7 coverage on all 3 coasts. In the recent year, the federal government has shut down 4 of those sites. In UCT's opinion, that decision has left significant gaps in our national marine security. Our members are the ones on the front line gathering necessary data and intelligence, but too often their role is limited to passing it up the chain. With this transition, the MSOC should not just collect information, it should also have the authority and resources to analyze and act on that intelligence, hence enhancing the national security of Canada. We urge this committee to consider restoring the MSOCs to the original 7 bases, ensuring full coverage across Canada. Expanding the Coast Guard's responsibilities with the MSOCs, ensuring our members' expertise is fully applied and not sidelined. Strengthening the Coast Guard's role in the MSOC is essential if Canada's marine security is to be cohesive, reliable, and effective. Finally, I must raise a practical but critical concern: administration and pay. Many public service struggle with the Phoenix Pay system. Yes, believe it or not, it's been 10 years since that system has been in play, and it's still not working. It's plagued with errors, underpayments, and long delays in correction when the pay is wrong. For this transfer, we were provided with a year's notice before fully transferring it over into D&D. That preparation is welcome, but preparation alone does not remove risk. Our members cannot afford to face another round of pay errors. They deserve certainty that on the day this transfer takes place, the guarantees we have been given will hold. That requires clear accountability before, during, and after the handover to ensure systems are aligned, oversight is maintained, and members are paid accurately and on time. We urge this committee to treat payroll stability as a priority. Pay is one of the most basic responsibilities of any employer, and it must be guaranteed throughout this transition. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, this transfer is an opportunity, but it's also a test. It's an opportunity to give the Coast Guard the funding, authority, and recognition that has long been denied. But it's also a test of our ability to protect the identity of a proud civilian service, to strengthen marine security, and to manage the transition responsibly so that workers do not pay the price. Our members are proud of the service to Canada. They do not ask for praise. They only ask for the tools, respect, and stability to continue doing their jobs. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any of your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ushtek, and I apologize for having to interrupt you earlier on. Well, we're going to move on to questions. To kick us off is a distinguished veteran of the Royal Canadian Navy, Mr. Jeff Kibble. Over to you. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions are through you to the panel, and thank you to the panel for joining us today Mr. Henderson, I don't think we've crossed paths before, and Dr. Bertillier, great to hear from you from beautiful Vancouver Island. Good to see you again. I'd like to explore two areas now that an OIC has been made effective, transferring the Coast Guard under national defence, specifically Coast Guard spending that currently qualifies towards NATO defence spending, and secondly, some of the specific changes that will need to be made. And I appreciate some of the excellent suggestions and observations that were made in your opening remarks that does address this, but I will explore that a little bit further. So referring to an August 2025 NATO press release, it defines NATO defense expenditures, and it says, in such cases, and this is a quote, expenditure is only in proportion to forces that are trained in military tactics, equipped as a military force, can operate under a direct military authority, and can realistically be deployed outside national territory in support of a military force. So in that light, what percentage, and this is for anyone in the panel, what percentage of Coast Guard training and operations is as per the NATO definition? What are they trained in terms of military tactics? On there.
Well, if I can offer a very brief introduction to that, I think the accounting is a little bit opaque. The Government of Canada has for some time now been looking to move more Coast Guard spending into that 2, now 3.5%. Big picture, I think the objective from that accounting perspective is to demonstrate that Coast Guard vessels and operations, which previously were purely civilian, now also have a security mandate. So, for instance, a Coast Guard icebreaker in the north, which is undertaking community resupply support and search and rescue capacity, now may be equipped with sensors in order to monitor, say, Chinese marine scientific research.
So as far as I'm not hearing anything about military tactics in that answer. And I'm also wondering, because you mentioned resupply operations, et cetera, what percentage of them are equipped with military equipment that gives them that capability beyond supporting the military? These are the requirements for NATO spending.
Well, today I believe none. However, that's the point of the movement into DND, is that we will expand.
Is current, fair enough, and that's what I'm looking for. And I understand, as we alluded to in some of your comments, that there will be an expanding. So they're now a special operating agency, and they're reporting to the deputy minister, not the chief of defense staff. So do you see this as under direct military authority and command as per the NATO definition currently?
I would say yes, but Chris, I believe you have your hand up. Can you add something to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would absolutely not see the alignment under the deputy minister as being part of the military chain of command, and to Madam Eschek's point, it should not be. I think that it is a civilian organization, and it needs to remain a civilian organization.
Thank you. Do you foresee Coast Guard units on operation? Sorry, in your opinion, can the Coast Guard, as currently trained and equipped, operate in international waters in support of military force, again, under the NATO definition for the spending, which I'm focusing on at the moment?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, I do believe that the Canadian Coast Guard is prepared and ready to operate in international waters in support of military operations. Icebreaking is a good example of that capability, but they are not trained in combat operations. They're not a combat capable force, and they're not equipped to conduct combat operations.
So you're
so if that's the
so you're suggesting, or I guess, are they capable of currently supporting the military and deploying into international or foreign waters outside of the Canadian Arctic and Canadian waters?
Yes, I am. I agree with that statement. Yes.
Okay. I've spoken to many Coast Guard members, and I find them in two distinct groups, both those outspoken against the militarization of the Coast Guard and those very much in favor. And this is a barometer type question. In your experience, what percentage do you have a sense for that are among these two camps? Because both are fairly outspoken groups.
Well, thank you for that. I think that it's important, the question of militarization. It may be an impression that's founded on, again, a lack of understanding of what is being proposed. It is not being proposed to militarize the Coast Guard. And I think Coast Guard employees, can be forgiven for not actually understanding that well enough, because this is a recent change and it'll take time for them to get into that space and understand it. This is not about militarizing the Coast Guard. It's about harnessing the Coast Guard to the surveillance mandate to support maritime security as a starting point. But I agree with the general idea that there are roughly two camps of people who are resistant and those who are very interested in pursuing the move.
Thank you. And Mrs. Shek, following that question, what do you assess the impact on retention within the currently short members of the Coast Guard would that have on those that are not looking for these changes?
Well, right now I can say that the majority of our members, what I hear is, they didn't sign up for a Coast Guard to become militarized, but there's other ways, as I mentioned, about the MSOC where they can be involved in that. They have a huge recruiting issue today. They've had for many years, and it comes down to retention. And a lot of that is underfunding and underpaid. These members work in very dangerous conditions, and they're not paid very well. You need to look at, and we've done it. They've done a study, and there's no one to compare them to, but they're very underpaid for the work that they do, and that's why they have a retention and recruitment issue. Also, part of that problem is the aging of the vessels. They don't want to be on vessels that are aging. They need the new equipment to be able to be there. And I know for women in the Coast Guard, it's a huge problem.
I'm not taking away from the excellent work that the Coast Guard is doing. I appreciate and have worked with them personally. They do excellent work. But I just want to confirm that there's no current capability to introduce drug smuggling, human smuggling, illegal fishing, migrant vessels, etc.
We'll retain that response in a minute. We were over time on
thank
those.
you. Sorry, Mr. Chair. I was getting
all right, Ms. Sherry Ramananato, over to you for 6 minutes. We're well over on that one. I gave him a lot of ample time. Sorry, Jeff.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. I want to start first with Mr. Henderson. First of all, thank you for your service. I know you not only served in the Navy, but also served in your capacity under various portfolios in the public service. I have some questions for you. You mentioned Bill C-2, and it includes expanding that mandate of the Canadian Coast Guard to add security-related activities to their mandate, including conducting security patrols and collecting, analyzing and disclosing information or intelligence. The Coast Guard and the Canadian Armed Forces will have a stronger and more coordinated presence in Canada's waters from coast to coast to coast. What do you feel this new coordinated presence means for Canada's security footprint in the Arctic?
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, my view on the improvements are that first and foremost, should it receive royal assent, Bill C-2 is going to formalize that role, which is it is more important than it would appear. The Coast Guard for many, many years has conducted surveillance operations to some degree or another, probably not as much as it could. But it hasn't had that formal role, so it's been more customary. And where that comes into, makes it complicated is when the Coast Guard is looking to develop capabilities or procure equipment that will support its improved work in surveillance, then people who have to allocate resources take a look and say, well, where does it say that you do that? And, it doesn't say that, so you can't have the money to buy that equipment. So that's one thing that I think is going to be a very direct improvement. Secondly, I think that with a formal mandate such as that, you're going to see Coast Guard crews and shore personnel expanding their thinking and their activities in the security space. And we saw that in the last couple of years when we conducted some I'll call them experiments, to improve security observation actions, running UAVs off ships in the Arctic. And the crews really stepped up. They really enjoyed that additional responsibility. And we saw a significant increase in reports about suspicious activity and just that integration and the flow of information. And I see that there's an opportunity to strengthen and continue and deepen the work of integration and coordination within the Marine Security Operations Centers, because these are customary organizations, they're not founded in legislation. They exist because they exist, and they ride on good relationships and personalities and a willingness to work together. But when you're in the same organization, that clarity, that unity of effort really helps improve coordination and effectiveness.
Thank you. And in terms of, you mentioned it was a modest start, but there's some gaps. And you did mention that you would recommend that we give a law enforcement mandate to the Canadian Coast Guard. And I know that in one of your papers for a constabulary role for the Canadian Coast Guard, you mentioned that as well, that granting additional powers to the CCG to act in the absence of the RCMP, CBSA, or DFO would augment quite dramatically the overall capability or capacity and effectiveness of Canadian law enforcement at sea. Is that what you're referring to when you mentioned that we should be giving a law enforcement mandate to the Canadian Coast Guard?
Yes, it is exactly that.
Thank you. My next question is actually for Mr. Lajeunesse. You talked a little bit, and I really appreciated the focus that you had on opportunity. The fact that we have the opportunity to have, I guess I'll use the word that Mr. Henderson used, coasties, working with Canadian Navy personnel and training opportunities and opportunities to use various vessels and so on and so forth. Could you elaborate a little bit on those recommendations and opportunities that we have in terms of the recruitment and retention, the opportunities? We've heard that there's difficulty in recruiting Canadian Coast Guards from one of the other witnesses. How can that interoperability between the Navy and the Coast Guard augment our capacity to recruit and retain members of both services?
Absolutely. Great question. One of the problems that we have is that we have two siloed services that are recruiting, training, but most importantly, building this new cadre of young recruits separately. Both are having trouble. The Canadian Navy in particular has done fairly well with its recent recruiting programs, but it does not have enough ships to actually put these people on a ship and out to sea. And so that is a bit of a bottleneck in their training processes. Coast Guard is out to sea all the time. Is there a way that we can create a more common training system? Now, if we could also create common training systems and standards for marine engineers, techs, and different professions, that would allow more interchangeability between the two fleets. That would have the opportunity of giving us, a certain degree of flexibility that we don't with two siloed organizations. There's also economies of scale. One of the problems that my partners on this committee have mentioned is that we don't have new equipment. Chris, you mentioned that the CCG really enjoyed working with the drones. The Navy is working on that too. This new equipment, whether it's certain types of ships and certainly drones and surveillance equipment, is going to be cheaper and easier to buy if we buy it in bulk. It'll be easier to maintain if we have a single coherent maintenance profession. And if we can combine the two federal fleets to get that economy of scale, it's going to give us an opportunity to build more faster to help retain people because they have the equipment they need.
Thank you very much.
Monsieur Servat-Tremblay, you have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Alors, merci à l'ensemble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for their presentations. My first question is for Mr. Leboutillier. Let's talk about the Arctic and its sovereignty. We know that Russia and China are counting or have a really extensive fleet. To follow the movements of those fleets, you need to have undersea sensors. You mentioned that the RCMP's surveillance capacities at sea are limited with respect to doing exactly that. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that idea. I think the committee's members would appreciate it. Otherwise, what are the necessary minimal capacities that the Coast Guard needs to have in order to play a role in the surveillance of the Arctic?
Thank you very much, pardon me, for that question. And it, in fact, grows from the earlier discussion about the role of the Coast Guard in the sense that when we look at intelligence collection and surveillance and the distribution of information, this is a vital defense issue, which complements and enhances the Royal Canadian Navy's capabilities. So we can say, in fact, that without any military training, further to the earlier question that was put forward about NATO requirements, that in fact the Coast Guard has a major role to play. The Russians have a petro economy. 42% of their economy is related to gas and oil extraction, almost all of it in the northern flank of Siberia, in Novaya Zemlya, in the Kara Peninsula, and elsewhere. So they have spent enormous sums of money, despite the war in the Ukraine, on the enhancement of their ports and surveillance in the north. Buttressed, as I mentioned earlier, by the 40-plus icebreakers, of which 7 are nuclear controlled or driven, I should say. One of the things, further your question, is that the Coast Guard, I would suggest, has the most intimate relationship with northern communities, leaving aside physical sensors, whether by surveillance, satellites, or undersea means. The Coast Guard provide an enormous entree into this vast world, and it is truly colossal, the space that's involved to monitor. So that relationship built over many decades is absolutely unparalleled, and one which the Navy benefits from enormously by virtue of its current relationship with the Coast Guard. So when it comes to sensors, whether it's by what Coast Guard crews see, what is garnered from overflights, what is selected from drone surveillance, the Coast Guard can play an enormously important role in terms of enhancing our broader understanding of what's going on in the north.
If I may tack a quick comment on to the end of that, Sarah, I think what's very important to recognize when we talk about surveillance of adversary activity, the principal threat is not warships and submarines, particularly coming from China. What we're talking about, and this comes back to the first question about Coast Guard's military capacity, the principal threat is hybrid threats. Illegal Chinese fishing, maritime militia, these are state assets that fall into the gray zone. So we're not necessarily looking to track nuclear attack submarines. I would argue that the most serious threat that the Coast Guard can respond to through, constabulary means is this hybrid gray zone threat in the future as we look at Chinese civilian/state vessels coming into the region, which I predict will happen.
Donc, est-ce que, pour être certain de bien comprendre,
to make sure I've understood correctly your last point, even if there's no submarine surveillance or underwater surveillance, the hybrid threats are being looked at, that there's no geopolitical threat, despite the context today, which is fractious.
I believe the hybrid threat is a geopolitical threat. I think that will be at the heart of things. Now, your comment on submarines, the simple reality is that Canada is unlikely to have a sovereign submarine detection capability in the Arctic. Dating back to the 1970s, we have worked with the United States to develop that capability, and we have developed that capability. And that's simply part of continental defense. It's something that we can do and have done in partnership with the U.S.
A few hands up, Mr. Did you want to have an opportunity to respond? Mr. Baultier or Mr. I think your hand up was initially there.
Yes, I did wish to respond, if I may, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to underscore the fact that the Chinese are dispatching vessels on a regular basis to the Arctic. They travel entirely across the Arctic, and while they will announce publicly that this is scientific or hydrographic research, I think we would be naive in the extreme if we did not imagine that it had profound security implications in terms of subsequent Chinese and or Russian submarine and surface actions. Thank you.
I'll give you some more time, Mr. Fodd. Yeah.
Je vois qu'il y a Monsieur Henderson.
Mr. Henderson also.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just would like to go back and perhaps provide some specific information in response to the question about specific capabilities. Can't hear? Okay. Speak loudly and slowly and hope that the interpretation sufficient. Firstly, the Coast Guard has.
Hold on, Mr. Henderson.
The sound is cutting out for the interpreters, but.
En tout cas, continuez, puis on va essayer.
OK, est-ce que sera mieux si je continue directement?
Would it be any better if I spoke French? Unfortunately, it's the sound of certainly. Mr. Savard Tremblay is saying it's fine for me, but might not make a difference for the interpreters.
Henderson.
Okay, I will do my best here. In terms of specific capabilities that the Coast Guard has and needs, firstly on the list, I think, is very robust data links. Satellite communications are difficult in the Arctic. We need broadband, large flows of data, both from ship to shore and between ships at sea. Uncrewed aerial vehicles for surveillance will be required, improved longer range radars, electronic equipment for being able to do signals intelligence and understanding what other vessels are out there using electronic means, remote sensing to understand flows of traffic. For example, there's a capability of putting all kinds of sensors on aids to navigation, which is a very good way of monitoring traffic. Dr. Boutillier referred to the outstanding relationship with the Inuit in the north. They are our eyes and ears, and that is an excellent relationship that needs to be continued. I made mention of the national area.
I'm sensitive of the time for the other members, and I apologize.
No worries.
Cheryl Gallant, you have, I believe, 5 minutes.
So my question goes to Mr. Lejeunesse. China's been sending more research vessels to the Arctic. What's the underlying purpose of their expedition?
Thanks for that question. As a quick aside, the Canadian Maritime Security Network is about to publish a very large report on exactly that question, which I'd be happy to send to you in the future. The quick answer is there are multiple different objectives for these research missions, which have grown dramatically over the last 5 years. There is legitimate maritime science focused on climate change research. However, over the last 6 to 7 years, what we've seen is hydrographic surveying, resource surveying. We're looking at salinity and acoustic studies, including acoustic buoys, which could, in theory, be used to prepare for submarine transits. So what the big concern is for both Canada and the United States is what's called dual scientific research that has both a legitimate scientific purpose, but could also be used to facilitate military operations in the future.
Is there any evidence to suggest that these dual-purpose vessels are armed?
No, there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that.
Okay, you'd mentioned gray zone tactics. Would they be in a position to sever undersea cables? Are they equipped to do that?
Yes, absolutely. There are relatively few undersea cables in the areas of operation where the Chinese icebreakers have been working over the last couple of decades. However, when I say gray zone tactics, what I suggest the committee and others look at are China's modus operandi elsewhere, How does China work with its maritime militia and its illegal fishing fleet in the South China Sea and its near abroad? And of course, it's not too much of a stretch to extend that pattern of operations into the Arctic in the future.
And again, Mr. Lajeunesse, how capable is our Coast Guard ready to confront a potentially armed dual-purpose Chinese vessel in the Arctic? How would the Canadian Coast Guard expel the Chinese vessel from Canadian waters when encountered?
That is less a question of physical capability than it is political decision-making. If we're talking about physically expelling a Chinese ship, whether they're armed or not, that has obvious political ramifications. And if we're talking about kinetic war fighting, then that's not the domain of the Coast Guard. That is something that the Air Force would be responsible for. But I would suggest that's more of a political question than one of physical capability.
So how prepared is our Coast Guard if it were to have to defend itself against these dual-purpose vessels should they engage and ram our Coast Guard or naval vessels in the Arctic, the way we've seen in other parts of the world?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we are talking about ramming operations, most of our Coast Guard heavies are Polar 3. They'd be very capable of ramming right back. But once again, if we reach the point where our vessels are ramming one another, then politically we probably have much greater concerns than fights in the Arctic.
And do we have units from our regular forces in the Arctic that are armed and equipped to deal with a potentially armed Chinese intrusion if they disembark onto land?
We do have the ability to project those forces. However, I would highlight that a Chinese intrusion onto land would be both extraordinarily unlikely and, of course, unlikely to achieve anything. I suspect our most capable, or I should say our most appropriate tactic were that to happen would be to sit back while the Chinese freeze to death in the stark Arctic environment.
So the U.S. Coast Guard is currently building new icebreakers. The polar security cutters are expected to be armed with two 30-millimeter Bushmaster Mark 44 autocannons and 6 crude Browning machine guns. Should Canada be moving to arm our Coast Guard's icebreakers with similar armaments to better counter Chinese in the Arctic?
There has been discussion of adding mounts for heavy machine guns on Coast Guard vessels, which I think is a very good idea. There's no discussion of adding larger or moderate size cannon like we have on the AOPV. And again, if we are looking at the Coast Guard as a constabulary force, which I think is the appropriate response, what they're going to be dealing with will be, like I said, this gray zone hybrid threat, illegal fishing vessels, which are unlikely to be armed, or maritime militia projected into the Western Arctic, which again, unlikely to be armed. And if we are in the position where we're fighting them with machine guns, then again, we have a bigger picture and we have the Canadian Navy in the background to manage that.
So the government has given some mixed messaging over the integration of the Coast Guard into DND. They've claimed that the Coast Guard will remain a civilian force and not be converted to an armed fighting unit. How would a civilian force be effective to counter potentially armed ships, be it in the Arctic or the Atlantic or the Pacific?
I think that the crux of this is the question of confrontation. The Coast Guard is not intended or will be intended to actually do that confrontation. They are being this move is intended to increase their surveillance capability and their communications with the Canadian Armed Forces. So in principle, the idea here is that the Coast Guard icebreakers in the Arctic will provide this situational awareness so that if we need to confront someone, the Canadian Navy and Air Force, which will exist in the background and be in the area, can do the actual confrontation.
Are the Rangers, Canadian Rangers, equipped to confront Chinese or Russian combatants if they ever intruded into our Arctic?
No, certainly not. And they're not intended to. Neither the Canadian Armed Forces nor the Rangers would tell you that they are a frontline combat force. Very similar to what we're talking about on the water, the Rangers are the eyes and ears of the CAF. They are there to tell the Canadian Armed Forces when there is someone there who is not meant to be there. They are not meant to be doing the fighting.
Thank you. Passing it over to Mr. Watchorn. You have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à tous les témoins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses who are here today. I apologize for the sound of my voice. Last night, I was at the Canadian Fisheries Council, and I met with people who were working for Fisheries and Oceans, and they are mostly favorable to the integration of the Coast Guard within the military. What I'm hearing today is that almost all of the witnesses are also quite positive about it. Our government announced massive investments, whether it be for the Coast Guard, the Navy, and the Air Force. And I'd like to hear Professor Boutillier on this. How does he think we'll be able to integrate all of this new equipment, all these new purchases, including relating to the Coast Guard, to better protect all of our borders, north, east, and west?
Thank you very much for that question. It is in many ways the central question going forward. As I suggested in my preliminary observations, time, ladies and gentlemen, is not on our side. We have a series of ambitious programs going forward, but the phasing of those programs is awful, in the sense that if you look at the Royal Canadian Navy, it has its Halifax-class frigates, which are superb workhorses, but they are coming towards the very end of their operational lives. And it is still another 10 years before the replacements will be commissioned and begin to move into service. Similarly, we've seen the government's announcement that they plan to purchase 12 submarines. Regardless of the source, it will be another 10 years before these are fully operational. And we could say that about one or two other weapon systems like the F-35 and so forth. So not only do we have an enormous deficit, a legacy of failed government expenditure over the past 25 years that needs to be addressed. But we find ourselves in a situation where the timing is not attractive. The same failure to provide the latest equipment and so forth applies, of course, as we've seen from the testimony, to the Canadian Coast Guard. It will be a major challenge, I think, going forward in the mid-2030s when many of those reanimation programs, in fact, begin to come together. Not only in terms of equipment, in terms of the integration of cultures, but in terms, as our colleagues have said, about personnel. Whether we can attract and retain, because all of these systems will in fact begin to be operational more or less in mid-decade. But until that time, all we can do, and that's why I suggested to you in my formal comments, all we can do is move with a sense of wartime urgency. This is serious stuff. We have dragged our feet far too long. We've accepted self-congratulatory excuses, and this is no longer adequate for either the Coast Guard or the Navy. So your point is very well taken. This is a major integrative challenge, not only from a cultural perspective, but from a physical one. And I think from my own experience, the senior leadership in the Navy, which is inspired, we're very lucky to have excellent people at the top, and of the Coast Guard, they are eager to get on with getting on. And so we have to streamline the bureaucratic processes to make this happen as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour la réponse.
Thank you very much for the answer. My next question is for Ms. Estruch. She mentioned the MSUCs and the closure of these MSUCs. Can you mention the bases, the MSUC bases that were recently closed, please?
I'm sorry, the translation isn't great, but I'm going to try to answer the question. If I didn't get the trans.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay. I heard you talk about MSOC bases closing. I'd like you just to enumerate the ones that were closed, and then I'm going to ask somebody else a question why they were closed.
Perfect. They went, oh, Jesus, I have to remember where the 4 centers were closed, but they went to 3 main ones. They have one on the East Coast, one in central Canada, and one on the East, I believe. But there's barriers when it comes down to that. Sorry, I don't have that data exactly in front of me, but I do know.
Your response for later, if I may. Tim, we are a bit over time.
Perfect.
Mr.
Sorry.
Savard-Tremblay, you have
Monsieur le
2.5
Président,
minutes.
ne le mettez pas dans mon champ, mais est-ce qu'on peut savoir?
Can we find out what the problem was with the interpretation to find out, to make sure that that doesn't happen again?
So the interpreters, yeah.
Can you hear the interpretation? Ms. Eschuk, can you hear the interpretation?
Finalement, on fait avant pour éviter ce genre de choses.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the interpretation.
Do you have your on English?
Yes, I do. But what I'm hearing is the speaker and then the interpretation is coming in very, very low behind
Oh,
the
no,
speaker.
increase your volume.
I have, it's at like 80%. But if...
Can someone increase the volume then for the interpreters? So, because it does occur with me as well.
Thank you.
This is the interpreter speaking.
I don't think that's possible.
Monsieur le Président, est-ce que les été fait avant la séance?
Mr. Chair, were the tests done prior to the meeting starting?
And what I normally find myself doing is increasing volume every time the interpreters are being used. The volume falls right back down, so I have to actually physically increase it. Do you want to try increasing your volume when Monsieur Savard-Tremblay is speaking and see if that works for you?
Sure, I can do that.
Thank you.
Parfait, on vérifiera après. De toute façon, mes premières questions.
All right, we'll check later. My first question's actually, we'll see at the end of my question to see whether that was heard. Mr. Henderson, I don't think you were done with your point regarding the capacity to detect submarines at other vessels, given we don't have much time. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Thank you for the question. And just so you're aware, I could hear the interpretation reasonably well there. I don't really have much more to add. Specifically, there are lots of capabilities that the Coast Guard currently has, but as I mentioned in my opening comments, I think that there are certain areas that would be well to add to the Coast Guard, specifically the National Aerial Surveillance Program, which is a small fleet fixed-wing aircraft with highly sophisticated surface sensors on them that would feed very, very well into the Marine Security Operations Centers. And if I might just make one very quick comment about the locations of those Marine Security Operations Centers. To the best of my knowledge, there have only ever been 3. One is in Esquimalt in British Columbia, one is in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the third is in St. Catharines, Ontario.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, the sound was too poor and Mr. Henderson was done speaking, but it froze for a moment there. Mr. Eschuk, can you hear me? In June, when there was the announcement of this transfer, that it was at least an option that the Coast Guard would move from DFO to Defense, you said you were disappointed then with the lack of transparency and consultation. You said you were taken by surprise. It didn't mean that you were against it, but you were surprised. Now the dialogue had just really started with the leadership at the Coast Guard. Has the coordination since improved?
Yes, it has improved, but I've had to ask for it on numerous occasions. I mean, we found out via a leak on the news that it was going to be moved. We should never have been able to find out that way. Can you imagine the surprise to our members and the calls this office got, wondering what that does for their employment? but the communications have to be ongoing and they need to be transparent. And when we ask questions, we should be able to get those answers. And if they don't have those answers on these committees, then they need to get them so that we can give the guarantee to our members that their employment is safe, that their jobs aren't changing. And if their jobs are changing, that it's done accordingly. But the communication at the very beginning was very, very poor.
J'imagine que vous, de votre côté.
I would imagine that on your side, I won't ask you if it was important to consult with the labor, but of course you have to. Have you done this consultation, and what is the opinion of the membership?
Today, we haven't done a lot of consultation. It's been a lot of consult told. That's what I tell when they tell us what's going on instead of actually asking for opinion or how things could be done a little bit better. And our members are out there. They're just continuing to do their jobs, but the lack of communications to them is very disappointing because they still don't know. We hear from certain politicians that it will remain a civil agency, but they're not trusting that information that's coming out.
Those responses, Mr. Scott Anderson, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to continue this line of questioning right now. There seems to be a great deal of confusion in the government. The government has said that the integration addresses the need for a more agile, efficient, and robust maritime force in responding to global security challenges. It has also said that it's going to remain civilian. There seems to be a lot of confusion both in the government and right here as to civilian versus paramilitary versus military. One of the first things I had to sign when I joined the military was something called unlimited liability, which essentially turned my life over to the Canadian military. That is distinctly military, a distinctly military thing. There is a cultural, informal, and formal distinction between military personnel and civilians. And I can read the definition of a combatant here, and I can read the definition of a warship. I can promise you that both of those definitions fit the Coast Guard now that they've merged with DND. Which way are we going? Is there any direction? I mean, I understand that the union has not had good direction on this. Where are we going with this exactly? Are we going military, paramilitary, which includes interdiction, or are we going civilian? That has an answer to it.
Mr. Chair, perhaps I can put forth a thought on that. I can't tell if you can hear me.
I can. I think his speed is too low.
Yeah, his quality of internet is.
What's that?
At this point, your internet is down. So there's a speed.
No, perhaps I could begin then while Chris comes back online. I think what's essential here, and we come back to an earlier conversation, is that there is a fundamental difference between the interdiction role, the confrontation role, which remains the Navy and the Air Force, and a sensing role. The point is that the Coast Guard, as I understand it, will remain a civilian agency, but the entire point of this exercise is to increase lines of communication, to knock down barriers, and to allow the Coast Guard and the CAF to exchange information, and of course to build the Coast Guard's surveillance capability so that the real combatants, which would be the Royal Canadian Navy, will have better access to marine.
The problem is, though, is when these ships are floating around in the Arctic with Canadian Navy personnel, they are legitimate military targets. We can call them civilians. We can say that, well, they're actually performing civilian duties, but in fact, any over-the-horizon missile launch is not going to distinguish between Canadian Coast Guard and Canadian Navy ships. They are performing with the Canadian Navy. They are combatant ships. So we can say that they're civilians, but in point of fact, they are legitimate military targets.
Well, sir, with due respect, whether they are legitimate military targets or not, during a time of war, our adversaries will target the Coast Guard regardless of what department they fall under.
Indeed, they will. Who will be in command of the joint operations?
I'm not sure if that's been resolved yet. I can't comment.
Okay. I guess my point is that there should be some, I mean, the merger has already taken place and nobody's quite sure about some of the major issues here. We're potentially arming the ships for guns. Civilians aren't going to be firing those guns. So either we're going to have Navy personnel on board the Coast Guard or we're going to have Coast Guard who are soldiers. You can't have it both ways on this issue.
I believe the long-term intent is to arm some Coast Guard vessels, and I believe this, I'm not sure, with heavy machine guns. But there's a big difference between that, which is for personal ship protection, and a deck gun, which would be for offensive engagement.
Well, that's certainly a debatable distinction. Being shot with a .50 caliber machine gun is just as painful as being shot with a deck gun. They're both kinetic weapons. What extra equipment will the Coast Guard receive going forward?
Perhaps someone else can engage on this, but my understanding is that that's not yet been resolved.
If my microphone is working, if people can hear me, I will give this a try. Can you hear me, Mr. Chair?
Henderson is breaking up, unfortunately.
I can hear him, but very low.
No, the interpreters can't.
Oh. Yeah.
Not good enough quality.
Okay.
You could perhaps send in a written response.
Are we trying?
Welcome your response. Maybe we can just send it in by a written notice. Unfortunately, I'm sorry.
Sure.
We are a bit over time at this point. I mean, I'm giving a bit of grace given the difficulties, Mr. Anderson, but thank you for your questions. I'm going to move it over now to Mr. Chris Mallett. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Mr. Lajeunesse and Mr. Henderson, but Mr. Henderson seems to be having some connectivity issues. Are you aware of any overlapping services that the Royal Canadian Navy and the Coast Guard both currently offer that will be amalgamated and or streamlined in this upcoming merger in order to reduce any redundancies, but also to not reduce services or resources for both the military and or harvesters, fisher people as part of this merger?
I don't believe that there are any obvious overlaps that will create redundancies. If anything, I think the sum will be greater than its parts, and that is the point here, that what we have now are two federal fleets working in silos and indeed creating redundancies in communication and surveillance. So if the two can work together, share a common marine domain awareness and operating picture, this will facilitate both the security, defense, and the safety tasks.
It's unfortunate that Mr. Henderson isn't able to participate. Could I just ask him to maybe log out and come back into the system? Because your system is freezing up. I don't know if it's the speed of your Wi-Fi or broadband or whatever you're using, but perhaps if you come in and out, we'll be able to hear him better. And because I think it's important that we have his participation.
Technicians work on that separately while we continue our meeting. Is that possible?
You can try to reconnect and reboot the computer.
Mr. Henderson, let's try that. Log off, and we'll try to get you back on.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Mr. Henderson as well on that.
Yep. Mr. Beaulieu, your hands are up. Your hands up, sir?
Yes, sir. I just wanted to...
I stopped the time for now. Okay? Go ahead, sir.
Yes. Further the question about the two services, I think that when we look at the Arctic, what we see in many ways is a landscape that is breathtakingly understood, in the sense that in many cases you'll see in charts of the Canadian North a single line of soundings that dates from somewhere in the 19th century. So the collection of data, whether it's hydrographic or whether it relates to the salinity and so forth, whether that comes from the Coast Guard or the Navy, both of those services can contribute to the combined picture. So further the question that you were kind enough to put a moment ago. Thank you.
Okay, then briefly further to that, I guess for either Mr. Boutillier or Ms. Eschuk, for the harvesters and fishers who possibly could be worried about a potential loss of capacity or resources from switching the Coast Guard from DFO to the Ministry of Defense, could you reassure them that this is a good path forward that will work to merge capacities and will not reduce services to them and possibly even enhance available resources and safety opportunities for them?
Yeah, I can address it. I've already assured my members that we believe that this is a good move over to DND. When it comes down to surveillance or to integrating into DND, as long as you remain a civil organization, I mean, you can enhance their services, again, like I said, with the MSOC in their surveillance, and they can analyze that data and get it back to the powers that be that need it. Also, I think our lighthouse keepers are underutilized. They used to provide a line of defense, and that seems to have gone away. But I do assure our members that I believe this move is a good move to DND in regards to funding and falling under the privy of that minister.
Thank you.
Mr. Bazan, you have 5 minutes.
Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses, and it's unfortunate Mr. Henderson's been coming in and out. Just want to follow up a little bit more on the talk around the future of the Canadian Coast Guard. I think everyone around the table agrees that putting them into the national defense mandate is appropriate, although recognizing the fact that not everything that they do is national defense, whether it's navigation, icebreaking, science. Very little of that has anything to do with national defense, and including that part of their budget under national defense for the NATO matrix, I think is creative accounting at best. But, and doesn't provide any kinetic capabilities to the Canadian Armed Forces. However, 3 out of the 4 of our witnesses, Mr. Boutillier, Mr. Lajeunesse, and Mr. Henderson, all talked about either constabulary, interdiction capabilities, potential some weapons on ships, and a law enforcement role. One thing that I look at is that we had at one point in time Canadian Border Service agents that were not armed, now are. It took some time. And I think Mr. Henderson alluded to the fact there requires to be a change in culture. We have the MV Asterix that serves as a supply ship to the Royal Canadian Navy, which has a crew that is both civilian and Navy. And you, Mr. Lajeunesse, talked about the potential of officer training on Coast Guard vessels. Would it make sense, if we want to keep the Coast Guard civilian staff, to put more Navy officers and sailors on Coast Guard vessels so that they can do interdictions, that they can do more on the national security front and law enforcement, as was alluded to by Mr. Henderson, especially if we go to a new Canadian Coast Guard Act?
Let me state that when I say that it's a good idea to move naval personnel onto Coast Guard vessels, I'm speaking purely of a training perspective. We do not have the RCN vessels available to do sea training, so that's a training possibility. We don't need RCN personnel in order to undertake interdictions, constabulary interdictions. RCN has no mandate for that, neither does Coast Guard. I do agree with Mr. Henderson's point that the CCG does require a stronger constabulary interdiction mandate, but for that, which it currently uses shipwriters, which are DFO or RCMP, For that, it would require a shift in its legal mandate to undertake those operations. And with that shift, it doesn't require Navy personnel, Coast Guard personnel can do those interdictions.
With proper training.
With proper training, of course, absolutely. It would be a longer term development.
Okay, I see Teresa has her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add real quickly that, not saying I'm with or against adding Navy personnel to the vessels. However, you have to consider the size of the vessels and do they actually have the room to house those extra personnel on the vessels? And I think the committee needs to take that into consideration. Thank you.
I appreciate that. When we are talking about new ships being built for the Coast Guard, there's a number of them that are under construction right now. A lot of them are science vessels, which, again, wouldn't have much of a role from a national defense standpoint. But if we're looking at icebreakers, if we're looking at some of the Coast Guard cutters that are in coastal surveillance, would it make sense to put some weapons on board, whether it's as we move forward? Professor Boutillier?
I think I might challenge your suggestion or intimation that because they're scientific, they're not of value. I think central to all of this is that the Coast Guard, among other things, expands the Navy's eyes and ears dramatically, and something that it desperately needs. That doesn't address your question.
On then if we can do this on all vessels, whether it's icebreakers, science vessels, Coast Guard cutters, what should be put on these new ones that are coming forward, and what can we do to the existing fleet to make them so they're better from the standpoint of both defense and surveillance?
Well, I think that in my estimation, it's not necessary to provide arms on new scientific Coast Guard vessels. That may be subject to debate, but clearly what we need, I think, are enhancements for the Coast Guard fleet in terms of communications and sensors so that they can expand the array of readings that they take while they're operational on our coasts.
I see, Mr. Okay, just a quick question to Teresa. On the side of the, we heard earlier that employees of the Canadian Coast Guard will now be considered part of the National Defence Employee Network, having access to both the Ombudsman as well as to the military sexual misconduct centers. Where do you fall into where we deal with Coast Guard employees going forward under the National Defence Services, and would you consider them to be veterans?
Interesting question. That discussion hasn't taken place, and I wouldn't consider them veterans of D&D. They'd be veterans of Coast Guard, which is a totally different entity. But that discussion hasn't taken place, or I haven't been asked or consulted on that, and I think that's a piece that's missing.
Ms. Lapointe, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. My first question is for Professor Boutillier. What lessons can Canada take from allied nations that have moved or aligned, more closely aligned their naval and Coast Guard operations? And how might this kind of integration strengthen Canada's ability to coordinate with partners through NATO, Arctic cooperation, and Indo-Pacific partnerships?
Well, one of the leading examples is, of course, China. But there we draw, from a Canadian perspective, the wrong conclusion in the sense that the Chinese have a huge Coast Guard, the largest in the world, but it is a paramilitary force, which is utilized as the tip of the spear in terms of Chinese naval operations. So there's nothing that we can draw, I think, from that experience other than to realize that there are countries which use their Coast Guard in a way that's completely alien into our own concepts. There is a robust Coast Guard community in the Indo-Pacific, Coast Guards which collaborate or coordinate in the North Pacific. And it's yet another arm of our reputational challenge, in the sense that if we look at the Indo-Pacific strategy from November of 2022, what we see missing is the failure to use our presence to advance Canada's brand in the region. And that's why, of course, the Indo-Pacific strategy called for the RCN to deploy on a consistent basis into the region. The Coast Guard is another arm of that presence to build relations with the maritime community in the Pacific.
I was struck in your opening testimony when you said that the key word for all of us here today was urgency, and that we couldn't be laggards any longer. If you were to look ahead 10 to 20 years from now, how do you see the integration of the Coast Guard into national defense, helping Canada sustain its sovereignty and security in contested waters like the Arctic?
Well, I think that we have failed abjectly over the decades with our Arctic strategy. We have had a great deal of rhetoric and almost no reality. Now, of course, one can argue that it's extremely expensive to establish infrastructure and so forth. But if you look, for example, at the Nanisivik exercise, we see 18 years have unfolded and nothing has been achieved. I personally would like to see a regular rotation of RCN officers onto Coast Guard vessels and vice versa. I think that we have a cultural integration issue that we need to address, and the personal links between the players are vitally important so that they don't act as two separate communities, even though they have different responsibilities. The Arctic is so colossally large that we desperately need every resource that we can, and the Coast Guard is so integrated into the tiny communities of the North that this provides enormous value added to the Royal Canadian Navy. So I think that going forward, I see a greater and greater synergy and value added to this decision to incorporate.
Mr. Lajeunesse, can you, from your perspective, how could this integration help Canada build stronger partnerships, specifically with Arctic allies such as Norway and Denmark, who face similar challenges in the North?
That's a very good question. I think it's unlikely that the Canadian Coast Guard will be deployed abroad to sort of the Euro-Arctic region. That's simply not what it's designed for. This is a coastal force. But within the North American context, I think we're already starting to see opportunities to integrate with the United States Navy and Coast Guard. This summer, we had an icebreaker that was essentially shadowing a Chinese vessel as it moved up through the Bering Strait. Now, whether that was intentional or not remains to be determined. But the fact that it was there, that it was relieving American forces that were not present, provides Canada with both something to offer in continental defense, and indeed even builds a little bit of a dependency amongst the American forces on our greater Arctic capability. So integrating the Coast Guard with D&D is also going to facilitate integration into the larger continental defense picture.
Appreciate it. Mr. Henderson, I hope you can hear all of us at this point. And we're going to test you out in a moment with Monsieur Savard-Tremblay. You have 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. Madam Eshok, let's get back to this issue about the lack of consultation. At the time, you said that you had some concerns because it was, you said, possible that this new mandate would not fit the conditions and the mandates under which your labor was hired in the first place. Do you feel more reassured about that? And can you develop a little bit? Can you get into the transition measures that could be implemented?
Yes, like again, this happened so quickly without consultation. From what I was told, even the Coast Guard were caught off guard. But I think, you know, if you're looking at expanding their national scope and the national security, that consultation does have to take place with us and with the members to see if they're capable of doing that and if that's what they wish to do. I mean, as you know, they all have signed letters of offer and their conditions of employment. And when you're changing those conditions of employment, people need to take a think of where their future lies. Is it within the Coast Guard, or is there somewhere else that they need to go in order to be able to fill their career? Because the Coast Guard members, it's their career. It's not just a job to them; it's a career. And if you're changing the parameters of those of their duties, then they need to have the opportunity to be able to want to continue on with that. But they often have to know what that means. And today we don't know what that means. We have the consultation hasn't taken place, and I'm wondering if the consultation hasn't taken place because D&D and Coast Guard don't know how that looks as a future. And I think that's what this committee is trying to is to determine what the future of the Coast Guard looks like. But as of today, there's a big question mark of what that means to my members.
Go ahead, one more.
I was hearing you speak about some other concerns. The fact that there could be an effect on recruitment, on staffing, on the necessary skills needed, and the naval resources that would be required. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, again, the biggest problem is the recruitment issue. I mean, I'll take the lighthouse keepers for an example. They're all term employees. Why? If they're deemed during a strike, they're deemed essential services. But if they're essential services and they're that important, then why aren't they hiring them indeterminate? And that gives job security. And a lot of our members on the vessels, they're term employees. I mean, they had the initiative where we called it the stop the clock, where, you know, after 5 years, they had an automatic rollover, you know, into the indeterminate positions. I was able successfully with the commissioner to get DFO to rescind that for our term employees so that the initiative the clock still was ticking, so that after 5 years or 3 years, that they able to get the indeterminate status. But that's a big concern, that they cannot get that guarantee that after 3 years that they have a job and that their term may be ending. So you need to be able to hire these members indeterminately rather than with the term employment. And that's one of the biggest problems with recruitment, is the term employee and the status of their jobs in the future.
Thank you very much. So I've allowed a bit of flexibility of the questioning up to this point. We're down to only 2 more. If I may suggest, Mr. Bazan, you're up, and then Sherry, if you can wrap it up. I think we'll cancel. That'll be it for the meeting today. Oh, actually, it won't be, because I do want to talk to you about something else afterwards. If we can go in camera then. Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be splitting my time with Mr. Kibble. So I'll try to keep this very short. I'm hoping, Mr. Henderson, that you're going to be able to participate. You had mentioned the change in culture that may need to happen within the Canadian Coast Guard, having both served in the Royal Canadian Navy and the Coast Guard. What needs to happen from a cultural standpoint, especially if we bring in a Canadian Coast Guard Act that will provide some of that law enforcement capability and interdiction capability within CCG?
Well, thank you for that question. I hope you can hear me sufficiently. I'm hearing you very well. No, I can.
The interpreters will determine whether or not they can do a proper job.
Let's try again. Keep going, Mr. Henderson, see what happens.
Okay, well, from a culture change, I think one of the important things is that the Coast Guard and the Department of National Defense need to take a long view, because it is a challenging, as Madame Eschuk has pointed out, it is a difficult transition to make, and people need to understand what their conditions of service are and will be. And that can take a considerable length of time. One of my experiences was with the Canada Border Services Agency when they were arming, and that took they gave themselves 10 years. They probably should have given themselves 20 years for that
Anderson,
culture
I
change to
apologize.
fit in.
They can't get translation. We'll go to another witness.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate,
Yeah.
But so I do encourage Mr. Henderson to send in a written submission.
Yes, please.
Addressing some of the questions that we've had, so that we can get his input, because I think his experience and knowledge is something that is going to be very valuable to us in drafting up recommendations when we provide our report to the House for consideration. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Kibble.
Thank you very much. And we mentioned gray zones and hybrid threats, and indeed Bill C-2 does not commit the Coast Guard to some of those missions, and we've determined they don't have this military capability, or it's not going to be moving in that direction. Is the Coast Guard currently capable of law enforcement interdiction?
No, the Coast Guard does not have that legal mandate. The Coast Guard serves as a
That's potential of what we're looking for. Do they have a capability for boarding or enforcing foreign illegal fishing?
In a sense, the Coast Guard carries the other government departments that have that mandate.
On their own, and I appreciate that they can embark RCMP, Navy, or
they do not have that mandate.
DFO. Okay, thank you. Just moving on to the MSOCs. Are they capable of receiving and processing surveillance and tactical data beyond phone, email, and type communications, and then sharing that with the regional or central or Canadian Joint Operations Center?
Yes.
They do. They have tactical data that they can share with the regional Joint Operations Centers.
That is my understanding.
Okay, and do they have cryptographic communications capability for sending secure messages, either via satellite, HF, or other forms of communication for this enhanced surveillance data?
That I can't speak to.
Okay, just moving on to unions. The Coast Guard is currently unionized under several unions. Will this be compatible with the extra requirements of longer deployments in operations that can occur outside of regular times that would require overtime operations?
Mr. Henderson wants to answer.
Yeah, because I
do want to answer.
Overtime to do extra drills, a boarding that may occur at off hours, et cetera. There's a significant cost there.
That is not actually the structure of operations at sea in the Coast Guard. Coast Guard ships operate 28 days on and 28 days off. The crews, yes.
Unfortunately, because of
Mr.
protocol,
Chair.
yeah, we have a process that we require.
I cannot answer. Okay, all right.
Sorry.
Peut-être que les collègues pourraient arrêter de poser des questions à M. Anderson. Si on a...
Perhaps colleagues could avoid asking questions of Mr. Henderson, given the situation.
And yeah, I'll appreciate that we'll get potentially a written response. It's my understanding that the MSOCs only currently operate part-time, 8 to 4, not 24/7, and I believe, can we confirm that that's a Coast Guard overtime issue that's caused that shift from 24/7 down to 8 to 4 operations?
The witnesses, I know that's probably a good question for our officials.
Ms. Ishik might be able to answer that one.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit longer from 8 to 4, depending. They still have certain shifts, but I think it ends at 9, depending on what coast you are on.
Okay, so not 24/7. Thank you. And will the Coast Guard, now that they're under Department of National Defense, will they fall under the Veterans Affairs for their benefits, post-employment, and also will they fall under the National Defense Code of Service Discipline? I know that these are issues that need to be worked out, but it seems none of this has been sorted. So do we know if they're going to fall under the D&D Service Code of Discipline for these types of operations? That service code is required when operating weapons, et cetera?
No, we don't know that.
Thank you. Do I have time for, are we done for time?
Sorry, we have one more question.
No, thank you,
going
Mr. Chair. I appreciate that very much.
No,
and
thank
I
you
look
for your
forward to some of
questions.
those written responses.
Yes, Ms. Henderson, please provide any more written responses if you may. That would be very helpful for us. Ms. Sherry Romanato, you have the last question, or the last round.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I do ask Mr. Henderson if you could please, anything that you want to add to this conversation, if you could please send it to the committee. I really look forward to getting your opinion on this. I want to follow up on the line of questioning from my colleague, MP Lapointe. Mr. Lajeunesse, you mentioned, we went there, and I want to get more information with respect to NORAD. When we look at maritime domain awareness, maritime warning, and maritime control, which currently is not under the, maritime control is not under the NORAD agreement, I'd like to get your opinion on how this integration of the Canadian Coast Guard to the Canadian Armed Forces can assist and provide opportunities for us in terms of our continental defense. So I'll go first to Mr. Lajeunesse, and then I'd like to also bring it to Mr. Boutillier as well.
Thank you. I think the critical thing to remember here is that when we're talking about safety, security, or defense, the kinetic value is not necessarily the deciding one. So the military has many platforms that are not kinetic enablers. These are drones, surveillance, etc. They still count as military capabilities. So what we're envisioning, I believe the Canadian government is envisioning for the Coast Guard, is civilian vessels undergoing their normal safety and security tasks that have this added surveillance capability added to them to integrate their marine domain awareness into both the MSOCs, the Canadian picture, and through the MSOCs into NORAD's domain awareness. Now, the real value from a continental defense perspective is not the new assets or new training almost, it's the added lines of communication, the improved lines of communication, so that as the Coast Guard goes about its duties, it can feed that information through to larger continental defense structures.
In that regard, I think you wrapped it up very well in terms of it's a civilian force that is augmenting the capabilities of the Canadian Armed Forces. And I appreciate that you clarified that this is a civilian force that is going to augment. It's not meant to replace, but it will augment and provide us additional capabilities that currently could be lacking. Mr. Boutillier, did you want to weigh in on this as well?
No, I just wanted to commend you on that summary just a moment ago, because that, I think, is really at the heart of this entire discussion. Of course, you're well aware of the U.S., Canada, Finland agreement to build a highly ambitious number of icebreakers. Whether that will be achieved remains to be seen, but it's yet another illustration, I think, of the integrative elements associated with the Coast Guard, despite the uncertainties emerging from Washington. Thank you.
To all the witnesses, and again, Mr. Henderson, if you could provide us any written comments, we'd greatly appreciate it. Merci.
Thank you very much to all the witnesses, and sorry for some of the technical difficulties that took place, but it's important for all of us to understand what is taking place with this integration, and we're going to have some of our officials come as well in the coming week, so your testimony is very helpful to us. I would ask the committee for their indulgence if we can have agreement to suspend and resume in camera for a moment. There's a few other matters I'd like to discuss. To the witnesses, thank you very much. You may go.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, suspend. We're going. you.